Good morning.
Good morning.
So for my senior project, I wrote a storybook called, thank you, The Winter Lake and Other Tales. The idea for this project came about in my freshman year when I took Catherine Turok's Gender Politics and Science and Fairy Tales of the World course, where we were looking at stories that have been repeated for generations. And in that class, I started to think about what lessons these stories are teaching us and if they're still relevant. And I wanted to stop and think about if we approve of these lessons and also if they are still relatable and relevant to children and other readers today. So I ended up writing 10 original stories. I didn't start with an existing framework. I just wanted to start from scratch. And they have themes that I think are more relevant to kids today, including self-forgiveness and body image and gender identity and sexual orientation, amongst a lot of other things. And it's aimed at slightly older children. It's a large book. It came in at just under 30,000 words, so it's pretty sizable. It's not your average picture book. But that being said, I did do illustrations for it. Each of the 10 stories is accompanied by a single paper cut image. You can see an example up here. And each of those is made out of 4 colors, only 3 of which were cut. And all of the characters are in silhouettes, which was important to me to provide a blank space for readers to project themselves or their loved ones or other people that they're trying to work through things with onto the characters and hopefully get more out of them, relate to them more. So I have a couple of examples here of the illustrations. This is a story about confidence and body image, a story about family, envy, and forgiveness, and a story about anxiety and family illness. And then I would like to read you an excerpt from the final story in my book entitled The Girl Who Walked with Death. And it was very important for me to include a story about death in my book because it was something that I really struggled with as a child. It was probably the hardest thing for me to accept. And I think if we talk to children about death earlier and more as a part of a natural cycle, instead of punishment for the wicked or a consequence of failure, I think it would help a lot of children accept it more easily and reduce a lot of fear that surrounds it. And because my stories are all connected, characters from one will show up in another, and there's a lot of similar locations, and it sort of all comes full circle. You'll hear mention of the other stories in the book in this excerpt. So what's happening right now is a young girl is sitting with her best friend, who's a bear. You can see under the tree up here. And he is very, very sick. After weeks with no sign of recovery, the two were visited by a young boy. He had wispy hair and light blue eyes. He sat down beside the pair and remained silent for a long, long time before placing a small, gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. It wasn't until she looked away from the bear that she realized, into this boy's face, that she recognized him. This boy was Death. The girl had seen death in many forms over the course of her short life. It had been the wind for the magpie and a star for the flightless bat, a pup for the wolf and a ewe for the small lamb. Not many creatures recognized it. Few even noticed its presence. But this girl was no ordinary child. She had been raised to observe the slightest changes in the land and the subtlest shifts in the behavior of the animals of her little world. Yes, she knew Death. She knew him in an instant. The girl grabbed Death's hand and led him away from her sleeping friend. Together they walked around the perimeter of the bowl. As they did, they spoke in hushed voices that carried many secrets. The girl knew that the bear was dying, and she didn't want him to go. She asked Death what happened after life ended. He told all he could, but there are things that even Death does not know. He asked her to tell him of love and beauty. He had worked with both many, many times, but he always ached to see more. The girl asked if anyone had ever escaped Death. He told her about her great-grandmother who had plunged into the sea. Instead of dying, she remained eternal, mixed with the crashing waves of her lover. The girl told him the story of how her father had helped grow a world to care for the creatures he loved. about how they had brought themselves together to share emotion and exhaustion that slowly nurtured a new world. He told her of the man that her grandmother was supposed to marry. His own fury had turned him into 1,000 birds that died 1,000 separate deaths. They talked like this for many hours before the little girl in death arrived back at the spot where the bear was sleeping. The girl's father was curled up against his side. The sun had set and risen again in the time that the child in death had been walking, and now cast a gentle, warming light on the four of them. Finally, the girl knew that it was time to let the bear go. She woke her father and her friend with a warm embrace. They knew from her sorrowful expression that this was the end of life for the bear. As much as she didn't want her friend to go, she knew that he needed to, and that he would feel so much better once he too had walked with death. She placed her tiny hands on the bear's great face and looked lovingly into his clear brown eyes. He buried his wet nose in her thick curls and breathed deeply. Death sat off to the side, watching this final display of love. He realized then that he too loved this family, and that he had to do what was right by them. He needed to take the bear away with him. When he knew that they were ready, he lifted the bear away, and together they left silently. The little girl and her father buried the bear that night, beneath the tree where they had first met. For several days, the child who walked with death and the man who grew a world sat beneath this tree and spoke to all who passed by, telling them tales of power and love. They told the tales of all the souls that had shaped who they had become, passing them on to all the creatures of their world. And it wasn't until after I had finished writing the story that I found a quote by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that really explained what I was trying to get at with it, and that is, those who learn to know death rather than to fear and fight it become our teachers about life. So after leaving COA, I will be spending a year with my family back in Wisconsin while I apply to graduate schools, hopefully for a PhD in educational psychology. Thank you.